So this is the slide I was trying to show you with Arca. So now you can see there she is on the cover of that album, Kick One, with the key works I mentioned, with the biography that I filled you in on earlier, and the quote, which I'll reread so we can come back to it together. When you're uncomfortable, that's when you learn something new about yourself. I exist in agreement with all the weird chaos, destruction, and agony that is undoubtedly part of the texture of being alive. And that quote really moves me. Because that first part, when you're uncomfortable, that's when you learn something new about yourself. I think about that a lot, right? There's some discomfort that invites injury, but before that, there's discomfort where growth happens. Growth doesn't happen during comfort. It requires a little bit of destabilizing in order to move forward. And I feel like that's in those moments of discomfort, that's when I've learned the most. That's when the art comes out. And this next line, I exist in agreement with all the weird chaos, destruction, and agony that is undoubtedly part of the texture of being alive. That resonates with me on a deep level. Maybe it does with you too. But I hear that, and one, I feel a little bit less alone. I feel connected. And also, I feel inspired. What does that mean to be in agreement with weird chaos? With this agony and destruction that is this texture of being alive? They're provocative words, right? And they've provoked some incredible art out of Arca, so I fully recommend checking out her works on streaming services or vinyl or other physical media. But when we're thinking about being an artist and making art, one of the things we might start off by asking is, what does art do? And there's no single answer to that question. Right? There's so many answers to that question. So I'm going to give you one answer. Take it or leave it. Art, in all of its vast and varied forms, expresses and encourages individuality while building and strengthening community bonds. And it does those things side by side, simultaneously. Right? So oftentimes we think about this dichotomy and maybe tension between the individual and the community. Right? Art is a way of bridging that gap. It's a way of binding individuals into community and a way of celebrating individuality within community. So it goes both ways. On top of that, art documents, encodes, and encapsulates. It motivates, it inspires, and it sustains. It moves, it changes, it questions, and it reassures. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, art is powerful because art is armor and art is a sword. It's protection and it's weapon. So art can be a lot of things. But when I think about what it does primarily, I think it's a sort of glue, right? It's this way of building and strengthening community bonds and encouraging this dialogue with individuality within that container. Another way of thinking of it is art is anything that's made by an artist with the intent to make art. Well, what then is an artist? And here, I'll refer to Genesis Peorage, one of the founding members of industrial pioneer group Throbbing Gristle, and an absolute gender outlaw themselves. Now, this applies explicitly just to music, but it generalizes. So Genesis says about music, everybody is capable of making music, whether they realize it or not. A musical instrument is just something that makes a noise. Therefore, anything that makes a noise is an instrument. But also, anyone who can make it make a noise is a musician. They don't need to know the, quote, right way to do it. And I think that's beautiful, right? And I think it applies to all art forms. And beyond that, think about the way that could apply to gender. You don't need to know the right way to do it. And in fact, some of the most interesting and beautiful gender expression is that which looks at the right way and chooses its own way instead. So an artist is someone who makes things, maybe makes things that strengthen community bonds, or at least try to, and that express and encourages individuality within that framework. Now, just as no one can tell us how to embody our gender, and no one can tell us what our gender is, because that's our truth, that's our journey, that's our decision, it's not up for debate, right? The same goes for identity and expression as an artist. Sure, there are lots of norms and expectations. Like I said, I felt really self-conscious for a while describing myself as a poet or even as a musician. because I didn't feel like I earned it. I didn't feel like that term was for me. I didn't feel like I followed enough of the norms, satisfied enough of the expectations. The same lies I told myself about accepting my gender. But when those norms and expectations become obstacles, well, then we push past them. And we all have experience doing that, right? So this is just another step, and we've already got practice. So with these thoughts on being an artist and making art, I'm curious if any of y'all want to share in the chat, what are some of your favorite trans artists? And what about their work speaks to you? I mentioned Arca at the beginning. I'll mention some more coming up and have a whole list for y'all to explore at the end. But we can take a moment in case anyone wants to share in the chat one or more of your favorite trans artists, and what about their work speaks to you? I know for a fact that we have at least a few trans artists in the group right now, though I won't, for privacy reasons, name them by name. But we have at least one trans writer, trans cartoonist. We have a trans musician, rather prolific trans musician, and I hope others, right? So I'll pause for just a moment in case anyone would like to offer an answer to this in the chat before we move on. I see a mention of Jane Schoenbrunn. I will mention her later. Also Against Me, Laura Jane Grace will appear later in this. Two fantastic, fantastic creators. Flummox, yes, Trans Girl Need Guns is a great, great song, and they're just such a fantastic band. I'd love to see them live someday. Yeah, Against Me is a powerful one. And Jane Schoenbrunn, actually have a copy of I Saw the TV Glow right up there on the top of my bookshelf. That film makes me cry every single time I see it. It makes me cry a little more with each watch. And if anyone wants to share what about these artists speaks to you. All right. So with Flummox, for example, I really appreciate not just their musical creativity, but the way they just go for the throat and say the things, right? The way they're not trying to be polite, the way they're speaking truth in ways that would shock people who just kind of aren't ready to hear that yet. And also just the way that they are unabashedly sort of just, what's the word? We'll just say pro-trans them. Brings me joy. So if folks want to continue to share in the chat, please do. I'll keep going into the next section, and we'll check in with some more questions as we go. I want to look now at the intersection of trans art and community, because community is a big word. We use it a lot, but I think it's good to, as much as we can, pause and see kind of what it means. But first, another artist spotlight. This time I want to spotlight Ryan Casada. You can see one of his greatest hits records, or I believe his only greatest hits record there, with a bunch of pictures of him in various outfits and poses. And the quote up top is from a song that I really like. It's the title's a little silly, I think, but the song really speaks to me because it's a very queer song. It's a very queer love song, and it's also one of the very few non-monogamous love songs that I've heard. It's called Queer Love Outlaw. And there's a line at the end where Ryan sings, "All my friends are outlaws and all my friends are in love." And those words just bring me so much joy. I remember the first time I heard that song, I was walking home from an event and I looked down at my little phone and I got the notification that that song had been released. So I listened to it and I just walked past my house and did a couple more laps around the block as I listened to it over and over, because it's just such an unabashedly queer love song. And this idea that all my friends are outlaws. Why? Because, well, if society tells us that we are against the law, then we will be outlaws, right? And all my friends are in love. That's that community. That's that joy. That's that euphoria. So who is Ryan Casada? Well, he's an American singer-songwriter, an actor, filmmaker, an LGBTQI plus activist. Has been on a lot of talk shows, actually. And his songs are hooky. They're infectious. They're often very tender, right? They speak earnestly and honestly of many aspects of trans experience, and often from the transmasculine perspective, right? And if you're interested in a sort of exploration of Ryan Casada's life from just about 11 years ago, you can check out the film Songs for Alexis, right? He's also starred in a number of other films, or at least had appearances as well. If you want a key work, I'd recommend the Greatest Hits So Far collection, which was released in 2023. Right? Lots of really, really good songs on there. In addition to the Queer Love Outlaw song, I'd recommend the song Daughter. So on this topic of trans art and community, we can ask first, like, what is trans art? Well, I've got a pretty simple perspective on this. We might think that trans art is any art created by trans artists and which touches on trans themes. Right? Now, it's important to remember in this that not every trans artist is openly trans. So there might be trans art, something that meets that characterization that we don't yet realize is trans art. I think about songs by Against Me before Laura Jane Grace invited the rest of the world in on her identity and sort of, as they say, came out. And there were songs that were very clearly about trans identity. So they were trans art, but the world didn't know that yet. And I see the example of The Matrix in the chat. That is another fantastic example, right, of the Wachowski sisters making a film that is very much a trans allegory, but wasn't really read as trans art, or as trans art in this sense, because people didn't know that the creators were trans at the time. But with hindsight, we see that now, right? And I think it's also important to note that not all art by trans creators needs to center trans themes. So just because you're trans doesn't mean that you need to make trans art. We're more multifaceted than that. We are capable of making art that goes beyond our identity, right? But we might extend the term trans art to encompass such works by trans creators, due to the kind of community connection, right? So we might think that they fall under this category, which we might broaden and say it's art created by trans artists, which often touches on trans themes, but need not. But what I'm not including in trans art would be art about trans folks made by cis directors. So Amelia Perez, I'm looking at you. Do not consider that to be a work of trans art. Do not consider that director to be a trans artist. But with that characterization, then we can get into this really interesting idea of what's called share bonding. This is explored in a book written by a friend of mine called, I think it's called This Life, A Philosophy of Being Alive, by the philosopher Nick Riggle. And in that book, he talks about this notion of share bonding. I don't recall if he uses that term, but it's a name for the phenomena that he explores. And here's a way to think about it. Beauty, whatever we mean by beauty, it can mean so many different things. But how we experience it, there's a near universal human reaction to it. And that near universal reaction is this desire to share it, to show it, to experience it not in isolation, but to experience it collectively and communally. When we hear a song that we love and we want to send it to someone, or we watch a movie that deeply affects us, and what we want to do is we want to show it. We want to introduce people to it. This is share bonding. It's a way of reproducing the experience of beauty. Right? And sometimes this desire to share bond can make us feel lonely. Like, I often feel lonely when I'm walking home alone and I see the beautiful Oregon mountains ahead of me, because the skyline where I live is just incredible. And so many times I just wish I had someone to walk with me so that they could see that view with me. Sometimes I'll just take a picture of it and send it to a partner somewhere, but it's not the same, right? So it can cut both ways, but this desire to share, to show, to experience collectively and communally, near universal reaction to the experience of beauty. And really, sharing beauty is one of the most loving, connecting, and deeply human impulses that we have. And when we take that idea and then we look at things through an anthropological lens, we can start to see that art serves as I mentioned earlier, this kind of community glue, binding us together through shared experiences and expression, interpretation, and appreciation. If a community is a group that shares identity and or values, art is one of the communal lenses for exploring that identity, for uncovering that values, and for communicating the shared connection. Art brings people together. It encourages openness and receptiveness, giving and receiving, and it fortifies connection. It doesn't just build it, but it strengthens it. So in short, I think one of the roles, one of the social functions of art is to transform mere groups into real communities. It builds culture, and culture is maybe that line between group and community. So powerful stuff. I'll open up to the chat. I'd like to ask another question if y'all would like to answer. What trans art helps you feel closer to community? And what trans artist would you most like to introduce to community? That is, who do you wish more people knew about? As y'all are typing answers, I'll share one that isn't going to come up on a later slide, but I'd love to include. They're a folk punk duo of trans femmes from Seattle called Sister Wife Sex Strike. I've seen them live a couple of times, and they're just beautiful humans writing really, really cool songs. Some about trans experience, some are protest songs, some are about spiritual connections, but there's a lot, right? And when I hear it, it reminds me of my Appalachian roots because it has that sort of stompy, twangy, bluegrassy, folky feel to it. But it's also very punk, which is another one of my deeply rooted connections and communities. And I try to introduce as many friends as possible to this band simply because I think they are wonderful and I want to share bond with people through the experience of enjoying them. Right? So that's my little spiel on Sister Wife Sex Strike. If any of you have any in the chat that you would like to type, please go ahead. I'll pause for a moment to see if there are any responses, and then we can move on from there. Okay, well, if responses are forthcoming, we can return to them. Okay, I see. So Laurel Charleston, oh, that's actually someone I don't know, but I would love to know more. This comment too, a lot of the trans art I love is pseudonymous. Yes. Yeah, so it's like, who is making this? It's out there, but tracing it back to an individual artist or person. Ooh, it comes from communities, not people. Mm-hmm. Community level art, not traced to individuals. Yeah, very cool. Very cool. I like that. Before this webinar, all of my art was done under the name that you see now with me. I did it all under my name, Lena, and did my work here under Lee, but I started to realize that this is the perfect time to merge those two personalities and bring my artist self into this space too. So it was previously pseudonymous, but no longer, because the pseudonym became the real person. They're all real people, but probably the trans flag on r/place made me feel most connected because everyone had to collectively fight to maintain it. And what that draws attention to is sometimes it's not necessarily the output, the artistic result that affects us most, but something about the creative process or the struggle surrounding the art can be just as powerful, impactful, motivating. Cool. It's a really cool example. So we'll continue on to the next little section. This is on now focusing on trans art and resistance. Our second of three main topics of intersection of trans art and other important things. The artist I'll highlight for this one is the artist Neon Yang. And you can see there the cover of their, I believe, second novella, The Black Tides of Heaven. And I just absolutely love that cover art. So I came to Neon Yang right around 2020, I think, when I was really looking for some more queer speculative fiction. And Neon Yang absolutely scratched that itch for me. So they're a Singaporean author of speculative fiction. They work in sci-fi and fantasy. And prior to that, they were a journalist, a few other things, and also, fascinatingly, a molecular biologist. And their work, and in particular their world building, it explores really cool takes on magic and also gender roles, relationship diversity, and more. So if you're ever looking for sort of high fantasy, but easily digestible because it's written in novella form rather than in like hulking tomes, right? But where the characters are non-monogamous, where the characters are non-binary, where the characters sort of change gender expression or identity as they go through, I'd really recommend their Tensorit series, which contains four novellas: The Red Thread, Fortune, The Black Tides of Heaven, The Descent of Monsters, and The Ascent to Godhood. You can find them collected under the name the Tensorit series as well. Neon Yang also has started a science fiction series called, I don't remember the name of it, The Null Void. series, I believe, where the first book is called The Genesis of Misery, which follows a character by the name of Misery. And in that book, one of the characters utters the line that your shame is unnecessary. It's counterproductive. And this reminds me so much of resistance, because I think one of the most important things we can do when we're involved in resistance work, and if we are trans, we are not even by choice involved in resistance work, just by existing. One of the most important things we can do is let go of our shame, metabolize it, breathe it out, process it, let it go. Because not only is it unnecessary, but that shame is a tool of the people who would do us harm in order to keep us down. Right? So here in the book, it's put very matter-of-factly. It's almost put in a very utilitarian sort of tone. Your shame is unnecessary. It's counterproductive. But for me, that can almost be a little mantra. Right? My shame, when I feel it is unnecessary, it's counter-revolutionary. It's going to get in the way of me being able to do the work that I want to do and help the people I want to help, including myself. Right? So I thank Neon Yang for reminding me of that. So sort of zooming in on this idea of trans art and resistance. There's this idea that I mentioned earlier during one of the very, very first slides of art as armor. And here's what we mean by that, or what I mean by that. So we live in a transphobic world, right? It would be silly to deny that, right? Maybe it's better to say actually that we live in a transphobic society, because the world itself is a pretty beautiful place. Right? But sometimes our transphobic society, it might feel like a sea of ambient trauma, like this death by 1,000 cuts. We go outside and there's just microaggression or macroaggression or passive aggression everywhere we go. And that word trauma, of course, it comes from the word for wound. Right? So we live, that is, in a wounding world, a world that wounds us. And the acts of creating and engaging with trans art, I think they can help protect us from those wounds. They can help us heal those wounds. And they can turn the scars into beauty and meaning. In Japan, there's a tradition of kintsugi, which is taking a broken vase or a piece of pottery and reassembling it with a golden glue. And the goal is not to reassemble it so it looks exactly like it did before it broke, because then it would still look like every other version, every other instance of that artifact, of that thing. It would look like all of its duplicates. But no, you let those golden veins sort of show. You fill in the cracks in a very visible way, because then it has history, then it has character, it has individuality. It becomes its own artifact rather than one among a sea of many. And those golden lines, that glue that seals those cracks and puts the pieces back together, it's seen as very beautiful. So that a reassembled pot that has golden lines all through it is more beautiful than one that doesn't. And I think art can help us turn our own scars, our own trauma wounds, into something similarly beautiful and meaningful. It's a way of reclaiming, a way of recontextualizing, reinterpreting, giving meaning to. Now, art isn't just armor. I also think it's a weapon. So it's not just protective. I think it is the sword that will slay transphobia. It's not op-ed pieces. It's not throwing facts and figures at people. I don't even think appeals for humanity. I think it is art that will slay transphobia. And art is dangerous. And this is why oppressive forces always try to silence it. Art is dangerous because art represents truth. And truth is poison to oppressive structures. And art doesn't just represent truth. Art makes truth felt. And art makes truth feel real. Art makes truth feel undeniable sometimes to people who would otherwise deny it. Powerful art can present you with a truth that you can no longer look away from. So when oppressive structures are trying to silence our art, right, what are they doing? Well, they're trying to take our voice. And when we ourselves shy away from making art, we silence ourselves. Right? And I don't think we should do that. These ideas of need to have a certain amount of talent, or need to have the right kind of publications, or need to have the right amount of practice or experience. No, don't silence yourself. Let yourself arm yourself with whatever artistic expression you please. Now, if art is armor and art is weapon, I also think a little softer. I think of art as love, and in a very literal sense. So in her massively influential book, All About Love, New Visions, a Black queer feminist writer, Bell Hooks, wrote that love is the will to extend oneself for the sake of their own or another's spiritual growth. And spiritual there doesn't mean religious. It means like existential, for your own flourishing. So the idea there is that love is this will to give, to extend oneself. For you, in the case of self-love, or for another, in the case of other-directed love, for their flourishing. And I think art making is one such means of extension. And that makes the creation of art an act of giving love. And I think the engagement with art, it turns it into an act of receiving love. So sometimes it helps me to think when I'm writing a poem that my poem is an I love you to anyone who will read it, no matter what it's about. And anytime I hear a song by someone who I admire or who inspires me, it's a way of me receiving love from them as well. So art is armor, art is a weapon, and perhaps even more fundamentally, art is a form of love. So I'm going to again prompt some folks in the chat, if you'd like, what are the trans artists that help you feel empowered, motivated, and strong in both yourself and community? And while I'm waiting for folks to share, I'll mention a few others. One is the trans femme punk artist Sadie Switchblade, who was the singer for the band Gloss, a Olympia, Washington-based hardcore punk band of all trans and gender non-conforming folks. Gloss stands for GLOSS, Girls Living Outside Society Shit. They recorded two very short, like 7 to 8 minute long, 7-inch EPs and then broke up. But that is some of my favorite music ever created. And once they split, Sadie Switchblade went on to form the band Dyke Drama, which has a very different sort of power pop indie rock feel to it. So that's an artist, Sadie Switchblade, and the very aggressive, sort of unapologetic reclamation of femininity with this kind of middle finger attitude toward it that helps me personally feel empowered, motivated, and strong in myself and community. And I'll pause for a moment in case anyone in the chat wants to share any artists who are similar for you. Jeffrey Catherine Jones. Ooh, another one that I'm not that familiar with. If you'd like to type any more into the chat about some of their work, that would be great. 100 Gex. Speaking of the hyperpop stuff we were talking about earlier. And I'll pause for just a little bit longer to see if they're Arca again. Yes, who we opened with today. I always find that anytime I want to make an Instagram post about anything, Arca always has at least one perfect song for it, no matter what it is. Yeah, what a wonderful artist. Not to say that's the measure of an artistry or anything like that, but just talking about how diverse and sort of thematically rich her work is. So we'll continue on to our second to last section now, which is on trans art and euphoria. And here I'll present an artist who some of you may already know because they really reached quite a bit of acclaim, but this is Alok. And Alok is an Indian and Malaysian American writer, poet, performance artist, fashion designer, and most recently comedian. And their work, it really embraces sort of unabashed, unapologetic love as an antidote to the violence of binaries. It is what we were talking about in those last slides of art as love, art as sword, and art as armor. Some work of theirs that you might check out is Femme in Public, which is a collection of poetry. Your Wound, My Garden, also poetry. You can see the cover of it right there. And also their recently released comedy special, Biology, with an exclamation point. Alok has also been an essayist, a public speaker, pretty prolific, and has also really put a spotlight on the fact that our own gender evolution can itself be an artwork, which is a topic that we'll return to. Right? But the quote there, it's from the Femme in Public poetry collection. Alok writes, "I'm sorry that the only way you've been taught to heal is to hurt." And when I read that, I had to put it down for a moment because I realized, yeah, I've always been taught that healing is painful. Right? But what if instead of thinking about that, we think of healing as an opportunity to metabolize, to exhale, to create, to build beauty into the world? Right? So, like a hydra, except instead of when you cut off a head to grow back, when you compromise my beauty, I just grow more of it. Right? That's what we can do as artists. Right? So, thinking about trans art and euphoria, when we think and talk about gender euphoria, we often talk about it as an internal state, as like a way of feeling, something inside. But what trans art gives us an outlet to do is to take that internal state, that feeling, that thing in us, and make it external, make it tangible, make it shareable. Okay? It's a way of taking feelings and turning them into realities that other people can then tap into too. So it's a way of me taking my euphoria, sometimes my dysphoria, but also my euphoria, and giving it to you. Right? Sometimes even physically. You can touch it, you can hear it, maybe you can smell it. It's a way of making the internal external, making the private public, making the isolated shareable. And I like to think of this idea of euphoria capsules. Right? So many of us here are pursuing gender-affirming hormone therapy, right? I'm on my 6th year, right? Yay. And as we might know, gender-affirming hormone therapy can ease dysphoria and also bring its own euphoria. That's oftentimes why we seek it. But we might see the creation and engagement with trans art as playing a similar role. It helps us along as we move into alignment with our authentic self and start to feel the deeper joys that come along with that. So me, I'm on a daily regimen of spironolactone, progesterone, a few other things, weekly estradiol, and a steady supply of euphoria capsules via trans art. So trans art isn't medicine, not in any literal sense, but it absolutely can be healing. Now, I mentioned, yeah, sometimes, we might use our art to explore and even not transmit, but to make tangible dysphoria. But the reason I focus this section on euphoria is because even though trans struggle is real, it's not the essence of our existence. Trans art doesn't have to be sad. Trans art doesn't have to be angry. It's understandable when it is either of those things. But so is the joyous and celebratory trans art. And I always think it's helpful to remember that we struggle so that we individually and collectively can find joy. Losing focus on that goal, no matter how far away it seems, can make the struggle unbearable. And I think what trans art can do is it can metabolize that struggle, remind us of the joy, and help keep us focused on that goal. So the struggle is what I dread every day. The joy is what I hope to find tomorrow. And trans art is one of the things that helps me get out of bed so that I can move forward toward that tomorrow. So if anyone wants to share, I'm seeing a bunch of different artists mentioned in the chat. What trans artworks help you find and practice euphoria? Right? And if you want to include your own, please feel free to name drop some of your own work. Right? One of the things I'll say that helps me find euphoria and practice euphoria is a poetry that I write, which oftentimes explores very grotesque forms of beautiful embodiment, right? And for me, I find body horror to be a strangely euphoric genre. Right? There's something about the way it takes bodies and it makes them into new things that I find oddly affirming, right? So in my little fairy body horror poems that I write, not actually involving fairies, but they have a fairy-esque quality to them, that really, really brings me a real sense of affirmed gender experience. And how about you all? If anyone wants to share, I see a song, Original Being. All right. So I will not say the name of the person who shared, but this piece by Blue Jay X, very cool. We can definitely check that one out. And if anyone else wants to share songs that help you, please feel free. And yeah, also, I'm seeing in the chat folks sharing their art social media accounts. Please absolutely feel free to do so that you can connect and actually support each other as trans artists. And if any more come in, I'll give them a shout out as we move on to our final section now before we start to wrap up. I do see one, a frog tale I wrote for Kindle. He will hide me in his pavilion. Okay. Okay. I'll have to look that one up. I like frog tales. So this last one. So a number of you in this space, it sounds like you're already pretty confident in your artist identities, and that's beautiful. But for some of you, you might still be on the fence, right? So I want to talk about this idea of cracking your artist egg and kind of letting them out. And the artist I'll spotlight for this section is this artist named Golden. So Golden is a gender non-conforming poet, photographer, community organizer, right? And their work explores intersections of race, particularly the Black American experience in the South, right? Of gender, geography, and more. And their poetry debut collection was actually a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for transgender poetry, right? That collection is from 2022. It's called A Dead Name That Learned How to Live. Highly recommended. And Golden says here, their quote at the top is, "Creating art is just something that's innately within me. I think it's actually harder to not create than it is to create art. It's just something that is who I am. Like I'll just be sitting with my friends and I'll hear a line of poetry. I feel like art is the space where I try to understand what I'm feeling." Right? And I love so much about that quote because feelings are tricky things. They're ephemeral. They resist description, but art finds a way. Art creates new languages for describing the things that are otherwise indescribable and makes them relatable. But that line earlier in the quote, I think that it's actually harder to not create art than it is to create art. That's one that I need to read more often. Because one thing I notice about myself is that when I don't create art, I feel worse, right? Because there's a part of me that is not being nourished, a part of me that is not being let out to play. Right? Now, not all of the art that I create is art that I'm going to show to people, but it's not about showing, it's about making. So I'll write a poem even if it's just going to stay on my notes app forever. Because again, the goal isn't to like spread it around. The goal is to actually engage in the creative process. Right? Don't care what happens to it once it's out. What I want to do is get it out. Right? So yeah, I'd really recommend Poetry by Golden if you get a chance to check out their work. But thinking about this notion of cracking your artist egg. So yeah, as trans folks, our eggs have cracked. And we've embraced our authentic gender and our authentic selves. But what if, like Russian dolls, there's another egg inside of us? What if there's an artist waiting inside, waiting to come out and transition into being, to grow and blossom and grow and express? I say, let's crack those eggs. Now, when I first started exploring gender, I felt a lot of imposter syndrome. I felt even more with being an artist. And that might happen with you too. So just like with a gender transition, your artist transition might confront you with some imposter syndrome. You don't feel worthy. You don't feel like it's for you. You don't feel like you're good enough. Those feelings are all really great signs. Take them as affirmation that you're doing it. Because if you're feeling those, that's evidence. Genuine imposters don't feel imposter syndrome because either they're not self-aware enough to notice it, to think about it, or they know that they're imposters, so they don't have to wonder. So if you're feeling that uncertainty of imposter syndrome, that's a really good sign that you are not an imposter. So take that imposter syndrome and let it motivate you even further forward into cracking your artist egg. Right? Let every bit of self-doubt that you experience pull another piece of that shell away so that the you that's inside of you can really come out and use its voice. And something that I mentioned with Alok that I'd like to return to is that we ourselves are artworks. As trans people, we ourselves are artworks. We are sculpted and crafted and evolved by our own hands and our own will, using bodies and thoughts and clothing and feelings as our medium. We are creation out of raw materials, sculpted into something that is beautiful to us. So to be trans already is to be an artist with the self as masterpiece. So the question I would ask you, if you're still in that process of initiating your artist transition, is what kind of artist will you be? Right? When I was a kid, I didn't realize I was going to grow up to be a girl. I also didn't realize I was going to grow up to be a songwriter. But I'm so glad that I grew into both. I transitioned as into a girl very late in life at 35. Can also transition into an artist even later than that. The line from I Saw the TV Glow, there is still time. So a question I'll ask if anyone in the chat would like to share is, if you could create any kind of art without limits, what kind of art would you create? Poems, performance art? Would you be a filmmaker? Short horror films. I would love to see those. Based on what you shared earlier, movies, I'd love to see those too, given what I know about your work. I would love to create performance art pieces, choreographed and intricate. I think that would be beautiful with a very, very narrative element to it. Little theatric oddities would be, I think, an area I would love to get into. But I see two aspiring filmmakers in the chat, songs of all types. Yeah, might as well explore them all, right? We got any other poets in the space? Anyone who would like to create, say, the next great American novel, but actually make it actually great and like super queer? Or if there are any digital artists, aspiring digital artists? Well, I'll look forward to hearing about and engaging with these songs, these short films. I love that. Bought a journal strictly for poetry. Very good. Another one shares, another friend shares, I'm going to try and write instead because it's accessible. I love doing flash fiction and short stories. Me too. One of my favorite genres of short story is the drabble, which is exactly 100 words. So like very, very, very short. A graphic novel, fantasy stories. Yes, please make these all happen, right? The world deserves your voice and the world deserves your art, and you deserve to speak. So please, please, please create. So I'm going to go ahead now and do our recap. See, drawing with colored pencils, keep at it. Yes, and also in the community hub, if any of you all ever want to share your art, please absolutely do so. Right? You can also put links to it in the chat here. But we've talked about a number of things so far. We talked about this idea of being an artist, of making art. We looked at intersections of trans community, trans art and community, trans art and resistance, trans art and euphoria, and then looked a bit at this idea of cracking our artist egg and reminding ourselves that as trans folks, we automatically are artists and we are our own masterpieces. So we already even have a head start. But before we fully wind down, I want to give you some more artists to check out. So you can feel free to screenshot this or wait for the recording to come around. But you'll also see some that were mentioned earlier. So Shay Diamond, amazing, amazing singer-songwriter and activist. If you haven't heard her work, definitely check it out. I mentioned earlier, Girls Living Outside Society Shit, Gloss, the trans femme hardcore punk band. You can find them on different streaming services and on YouTube, a bunch of different live recordings. You can check out Laura Jane Grace, who has both a solo career as an iconic like punk singer-songwriter and is also the founder of Against Me, who has also deep folk punk roots and has written, in my view, the saddest song ever, which is off the Transgender Dysphoria Blues album, True Trans Soul Rebel, which is a very happy, upbeat song, but I find it gut-wrenchingly, agonizingly sad. Maybe some of you all will relate. If you like things on the louder side, the Here's Collective, fronted by trans femme Jenna Pup, a wonderful, wonderful band that is extremely abrasive, extremely intense, and extremely, extremely queer. I see the question in the chat, who wrote Beyond the Gender Binary? I believe you're thinking there of Alok, who was one of the featured artists earlier. Yeah, if we're thinking of the same book. I'd recommend, if you're interested in Gothic horror, you might check out William Joseph Martin, who is a sort of long-standing and prolific Gothic horror novelist. Most of Martin's works are published under the name Poppy Z. Bright, so feel free to check them out. Alison Rumfitt is a novelist, a trans femme novelist specializing in grotesque and psychological horror. Her book, Tell Me I'm Worthless, is not one that I can recommend because it is, I think, so much of a difficult read because it touches on difficult aspects of trans experience so much. But I said in a review that I wrote of the piece that I think it is a piece that needed to be written, and I'm glad that it exists. It reads as an exorcism, but it's one that I wouldn't want to read again, right? But still, someone to keep on your radar. Mentioned by someone in the chat earlier, Jane Tronbrun, right? Trans director, filmmaker of I Saw the TV Glow, and hopefully many, many, many future projects. If you haven't already, check out Sophie. Right? If you like Arca and you don't know Sophie, first of all, I'm confused, but check out Sophie. Her life was ended way, way too short, but incredibly influential and groundbreaking producer, especially if you like odd and experimental sounds, right? Something about trans folks and experimental music. I don't know what it is, but I think we're in the lead when it comes to that stuff. So you can check out all of these artists, plus check out all the ones that were mentioned in the chat as well. But remember too, your friends, your community, and yourself. Right? My favorite trans artists are the ones who live in my backyard. Right? My favorite trans artists are the ones who go to the open mics that I attend. My favorite trans artists are the ones who play songs when we're hanging out together in our living rooms. Right? That can be such a beautiful experience. Right? So if you have friends who are on the fence about their artist identity, one thing you can do for your community is really encourage them to lean into it, because you deserve to be heard. They deserve to be heard. You can amplify each other's voice, and we all lift each other up. So we'll go ahead and start winding down there. There's a couple other events coming up that I would like to put on your radar. You can sign up for all of these on the Community Hub. For public webinars, on May 1st, there's a book talk on the book Am I Trans Enough by the author, Aloe Johnston, so check it out. And then just a few days after that, on May 6th, there is Queer Financial Literacy 102. And then for our member-exclusive events, there are a few that are spinning out of this webinar when it comes to making trans art. We'll have one on digital quilt making. You can check out the description on the Hub. It sounds absolutely fascinating. On the 11th of May, there will be a space focused on tattoos as gender euphoria, which I absolutely hope to attend. And then just a few days after that, on the 14th, there will be a broader webinar, again, still just members only, on makeup outside the binary, right? Later in this month, I'll be doing another zine making workshop for anyone who wants to come in and collaborate on that. Very excited about it. And if you'd like to take a couple moments, you can go to that link, bit.ly/Plume feedback, or you can scan that QR code and just offer us some thoughts in response to this webinar. Give us your feedback. Let us know what you liked, what we should keep doing, what you'd like to see in the future, and we can absolutely work together to make it happen. Right? You'll also get that link in the follow-up email. So if you're not able to or just don't feel like doing it right now, you will have time. And I'm going to go ahead and say thank you all so much. I spend a lot of time making art. I spend a lot of time thinking about art, and I spend all of my time being trans. So getting to talk with you all about the intersection of these things really was an honor and a really fulfilling experience for me. So thank you all for being a part of it. So we can pause now for a couple minutes if there are any questions that anyone would like to ask. I guess you can answer them too. But I can open it up for questions before we stop the recording. So if anyone has any, please feel free to just go ahead, type them in, and we can chat. I know we have a smaller group tonight, so it's understandable that things are a little more quiet than usual. You can also follow up with questions on the community hub if any come up, and we can check in there. What's the horror story you mentioned, if that's okay, the difficult one? Yeah, so it's this novel called Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. And the reason I find it difficult is because part of it takes place in the mind of a frantic, deeply traumatized trans girl, and the other POV character is a TERF. And that is a really, it's a lot. And some of the writing and formatting is very experimental, and it confronts some very, very raw traumatic experiences. So it's the sort of work that, like I said, it reads like a purging from the author, like it's something that needed to get out. But it's a hard book to recommend because I think any trans person who reads it would struggle with the themes because they're so real. And I think any cis person who reads it, it's going to go over their head. So it might be a book that needed to be written with an audience of none. But yeah, I see you sharing that yours is meant to be a purging too. Absolutely. I think that's an absolutely valid way to create art. Again, not all art has to be public. We can create and then keep it for ourselves as a means of just getting it out. Or we can create to purge and then let other people see what has been purged, because that might be helpful, illuminating, etc., as well. Right? But thanks for sharing. If there's any other questions, I can stick around to answer that as well.